Hello friends, this is Jerry Thomas from Sakshi Apologetics Network. Today we are going to look at a very interesting subject, the Indian Astrology. Before we dwell into that subject, let me begin by asking you a very simple question. Have you heard books such as Doctrine of Romans or Doctrine of Paul or the book written by the Lord of the Greeks? If you think these are Christian books, you are wrong. These are some of the canonical texts of the Indian astrology. Yes, you read it, you heard it right. These are basic texts in Indian astrology. Of course, they spell it in Sanskrit. Instead of Doctrine of Romans, they say PANCASIDDHANTA. Instead of Doctrine of Paul, they say PAULISA SIDDHANTA. Or the books written by the Lord of the Greeks, they say as Yavana Jataka by Yavaneshwara. So those Sanskrit terms might not be very obvious when we hear it for the first time, but when we look into those are books of the Romans or of the Greeks or of one Paul or a book attributed to of Greek origin. Now you might ask, how come these books are there in the Indian astrology? The reason is the Indian astrology has heavily borrowed from the Romans, the Greeks and the others, Babylonians and the others. We are going to look at it. Now, why is it important for us to look at this topic? Let me give you at least 3 reasons. Generally, when we hear about astrology, we think in terms of the horoscope, of the stars that you are born in. But astrology is not just that. Bill M. Mack, a researcher in Needham Research Institute, Cambridge, he gives us in Indian Jyotisa through the lens of Chinese Buddhist canon, in the paper that he wrote, he gives us 3 classifications or 3 divisions within the astrology. When you hear that, you will know why we have to look at this subject. One part of the astrology is mathematical astronomy or Ganita. The other, of course, is the horoscope, and third one is the divinations. So astrology has a mathematical part as well. Now this is very important for us because in the upcoming episodes, we will be looking at some of the mathematical contributions of India. At that time, the roots of those mathematical contributions, we should know that they are based in the Indian astrology. Aryabhatta or Brahmagupta, they were astrologers. So we will have to understand the roots of the Indian astrology to understand the roots of the Indian mathematics itself. That is one of the reasons that we are looking at it. Now that is not the only reason. Indian astrology is considered as part of the Vedic system. There are 6 auxiliaries or 6 limbs for the Vedas. One of the limb is considered as Jyotisha or the astrology. Now this is very important. If one of the limbs of the Vedas is borrowed from Romans and Greeks, then what is it that they speak about the Vedic culture? Even your limb, auxiliary of the Vedas, is borrowed from outside. So that is a very important question that we have to raise when we bust the myth of the golden Vedic age. There is nothing called golden Vedic age. If there are some good contributions, it is in collaboration with all the other cultures. It is not derived from the Vedas. Vedas has a small component to that. That's it. So it is very important for us to know it from the Indian mathematical contribution, and also to bust the myth of the golden Vedic age, because if you have derived even on your own Vedic system of study from others, you have nothing else to claim. And also a minor point in this, they often accuse, the Hindutva group often accuses the Christians or the others, oh, you are following a foreign religion, you are taking things from there. How about you? If you have borrowed from the Romans and the Greeks, what right you have to point finger at me if I have also taken book of Romans? If I have followed the Apostle Paul rather than some Paul who is a astrologer? And if I have accepted the Lord Jesus Christ? You are following the Lord of Yavana. I am following the Ishvara of the entire world. So what is the difference? I have better case for myself than you have for the Indian astrology. So these are some of the reasons why we have to look at the Indian astrology. So without wasting much time, let us look into the subject. Has the Indian astrology borrowed from others? Now let me tell you the importance of this. Let me emphasize it. This is very uncomfortable premise for the people who propagate the Vedic golden age myth. SWAMI Vivekananda was one of the key proponents of the Vedic golden age myth. He felt very uncomfortable at this thought. Let me give you an example. Brihad Samhita is one of the Indian astrological books. In Brihad Samhita, Adhyaya 2, Sloka 14, it is in the translation of Pandita Bhushana V. Subramanya Shastri. It says, the Yavanas are of low origin. Yavanas are Greeks. Greeks, we Indians used to call them as Yavanas. Yavanas are of low origin. When this science, the science here is the astrology, has come to stay with them, and when such astrologers are worshipped as sages or rishis, how much more should an astrologer of Brahmin origin be? So this is acknowledging that they were very well aware of the Greek astrology, and the Greek astrologers were considered as sages. Swami Vivekananda himself translated this. In Swami Vivekananda's complete works, volume 4, translations, Pros de Paris, the Congress of History of Religions. You will get it in the complete edition of Swami Vivekananda's book. You will get it in Kindle. So I have taken it from the Kindle edition. Swami Vivekananda also translates this slogan like this. The Yavanas are mlechas. Mlechas are foreigners, and more mlechas are abominable ones by the very virtue, whether the very reason of they being a foreigner. In them the science is established, the astrology is established. Therefore even they deserve worship like rishis. So the Greeks in an Indian astrological book were considered as rishis, and they deserve to be worshipped as rishis. Now Swami Vivekananda felt very uncomfortable in one of the interpretations of this, or the correct interpretation of this sloka. The people pointed out this sloka and told, see, you have learned from the Greeks. Swami Vivekananda becomes very uncomfortable, and he says, the meaning may be that the learning of the Mlecha disciples of the Aryan teachers is praised here only to encourage the Mlechas in the pursuit of Aryan science. So Swami Vivekananda is saying, no, this sloka doesn't mean that they were teachers or they are rishis in the way we understand them. This sloka is only meant to encourage the Mlechas to learn an Aryan science. This astrology is 100% Indian only. And he goes on to say, secondly, when the gem of every Aryan science is found in the Vedas, this is what we were referring to, and every step of any of those sciences can be traced with the exactness from the Veda to the present day. So he is completely rejecting the idea that the Indian astrology has borrowed from the West. You see how uncomfortable they become on this. Now let us examine this. So we will look at it in a chronological way. David Pingree, who lived from 1933 to 2005, was a professor of mathematics and classics at Brown University. Now, David Pingree's specialization was astrology, cross-cultural transmission, mathematics and all. One of his thesis, one of his very controversial proposal, that there is no originality in the Indian astrology at all. Now, that is not entirely true. As I said, there is a small Vedic component to it, but this was David Pingree's thesis, and he had very good reasons also to articulate that. Some of those which are challenged, but most of those still are valid. Now, David Pingree gave us a chronological order. Now, this is quoted in the same Billam Max paper that I referred to earlier, Indian Jyotisha through the lens of Chinese Buddhist canon. So, the Indian astrology as per David Pingree can be divided into 5 stages. One is the Vedic, that is 1000 to 400 BC. Second is the Babylonian, when Vedanga Jyotisha was also supposed to be written. Third is the Greece and Babylonian influences. And fourth is the Greek, and fifth is the Islamic. So David Pingree had told that this Vedic era, there is hardly anything that you can call as astrology. The real astrology comes with the influence of the Babylonian in the Vedanga Jyotisha. Now this is not, this is where the dispute is, that the Vedanga Jyotisha is not completely derived from others, but it has a component of the Vedas, and it has a derivation from others also. That is one part. The third is the Greece and Babylonian, and the fourth is the Greek. Now the fourth part is very important for us, because that is AD 400 to AD 1600, which is the time that coincides with the golden age of the Indian mathematics. When we speak about zero or trigonometry, Aryabhatta, Brahmagupta, all of them lived at that age. So that age, David Pingree says it is heavily borrowed from the Greek. So for us, that age is the most important age to consider. But we will also look at the Vedanga Jyotisha in a very brief way, because Vedanga Jyotisha, our Indian Hindutva scholars would argue that it is completely from the Vedas. The Harvard professor Michael Witzel is a German-American philologist and a comparative mythologist and an Indologist. He points out this dating of the Vedas, and in that context he speaks about the dating of the Vedanga Jyotisha as well. So he says how the Indian scholars or the Hindutva scholars would date them. They go by the nakshatra mentioned in the Vedanga Jyotisha book, and he points out the error in that. He says, first of all, that is not very clear. When exactly the star, which star is speaking about, those things are not very clear. Leave that matter. Let us give that for argument's sake. He says, again this would mean to date the text according to its earliest item. You see, whatever is the earliest item mentioned in the book, the Hindutva scholars would argue that should be considered as the date of the book. Now, that is a special pleading. You will never date a book like that. You would actually date the book to the latest item mentioned in that book. Suppose if I write a book and I speak about Narendra Modi as the Prime Minister, and I also speak about Jawaharlal Nehru as the Prime Minister, you would never date my book as written in the book when Jawaharlal Nehru was alive. You would say that this book was written either during the time of Narendra Modi or after him. So you would date it according to the latest item, not the earliest item. But the Hindutva scholars would always want their books to be dated according to the earliest item mentioned in the book, and they would argue the same for the Vedanga Jyotisha. Now that is a special pleading. Special pleading, the Hindutva scholars have mastered the art of special pleading. For everything in the world, they want them to be treated separately from all the others, and their arguments, however foolish, should be taken into consideration. We will leave that. And Michael Bishop goes on to point out in the autonomous Aryans, the evidence from Old Indian and Iranian text. He published in the Electronic Journal of Vedic Studies, volume 7. He says, the astronomical system, some of the Hindutva scholars themselves would agree that the astronomical system mentioned in the VEDANGAJYOTISA is very similar to Gargasamhta. We will look at why the importance of this book is referred here. Because Gargasamhta, if it is similar to the Gargasamhta is more or less copied from outside. The astronomical system is borrowed from outside. And if VEDANGAJYOTISA is actually similar to Gargasamhta, then both of them must have been contemporary, again coinciding with the date of a later date. You see, the astronomical system in the VEDANGAJYOTISA could have been borrowed from outside, then the date should be later, and it should be also accepted that it has borrowed while it has a Vedic element in it. Now this is, third point is a very interesting thing. The very book text, the language of the VEDANGAJYOTISA is written in epic Sanskrit. It is not written in the archaic, the Vedic Sanskrit. It is later written in a much more developed Sanskrit, that is where we treat it as from either earliest from BC 300 and all, we date it. So the VEDANGAJYOTISA should have been written at the same time. Now Michael Witt says, for further indication of the late date of the Jyotisha is that the language of the text is post-Vedic, which lets Shastri assume that it was redacted by someone belonging in the late centuries BC. So if the language of the text itself is written in a much more later Sanskrit, why would you date it 800 years before that? There is no reason other than special pleading. So here the Hindutva scholars would want us to consider, okay, it was written in some archaic Sanskrit earlier, but it was written later in an epic Sanskrit redacted by someone. There is absolutely no evidence for that. Absolutely no evidence. But we have to accept the special pleading of the Hindutva scholars all the time. They have no good arguments. All the time they present is a special pleading. So, as I said, this either we will have to date it by the earliest item mentioned. The astronomical system is very comparable to the Gargasamhta, and the third, the language itself is written in a late the epic Sanskrit time. So this is obvious for anyone who is objective that this book is written in a later period, and this could have been heavily influenced by the Babylonian and the other influences, as David Pegri rightly points out. Now let me point out one more point regarding the Gargasamhta. In the Bill M. Mack, whom I quoted earlier, in the another paper, in Greco-Babylonian Astral Science in Asia, the patterns of dissemination and transformation, he says the Babylonian astronomical system is characterized by the use of 12-part divisions of the celestial sphere as a coordinate, the use of sexagesimal unit, that is, they don't consider 10 as the base, they consider 60 as the base of their numbering, and an arbitrary division of syndonic month into 30 days in the lunar table. The first two, which is the 12-part division and the 60 as the base, since they are not present in the entire Vedic corpus, chronologically they are the most likely transmitted to India as part of Hellenistic astral science. So here he is speaking about Gargasamhta and the astronomical system that contained in the Gargasamhta, and he says they are very similar to the Babylonian system. And those two, there are out of the three items that he pointed out, he says that two are totally absent in the Vedic system. Therefore, we must, we have every reason to assume that it is actually borrowed from the Babylonian system. So this is the VEDANGAJYOTISA. As I said, for us, what is most important is the time that Aryabhatta and the others lived, which is considered as the golden age of mathematics in India. We are most interested in that stage, where there was a heavy borrowing from the Greeks. So if astrology was borrowed from the Greeks, then we have every right to argue the other parts of the astrology, the mathematics also was borrowed and improved upon by the Indians. So let us look at it. We have clear evidence here, indisputable evidence. Varahamihira, who lived during AD 505 to 585, was one of the greatest astrologers of India. He lived during the golden age of Indian mathematics. The previous quote that we started with from Brihat Samhita is a book of Varahamihira. Now we will look at another of his book, PANCASIDDHANTIKA, the 5 Siddhantas of the astrology. So in the PANCASIDDHANTIKA written by Varahamihira, in chapter 1, in the sloka 3, it mentioned about 5 basic foundational texts of the Indian astrology as per this great Indian astrologer himself. And he says, PAULISA, or one of the Paul, Romaga, one by Romans, Vaisisya, that is the Indian, Saura, that is the Asuras actually, and Paidamaha. So of this 5, 3 of them are non-Brahmanical. 2 of them are outside India as well. Now Asura book, we can give credit to anybody who wants. We can either think that Asura is Dravidians or whomever the scholars would consider. Now Varahamihira also compares the precision of these 5 schools to one of the angas in the astrology, that is a Tithi. He says PAULISA is tolerably accurate, but the astrology from Paul is tolerably accurate, and Romaga approximate to that. One from the Romans is approximate to that. Asura is the very accurate one, but the other 2, Vaisisya and Paidamaha, have slipped away from the real. They are not at all accurate as far as this Anga is considered. You see, Asuras is the best, and Paul's and Romans are tolerably accurate, but the real Indian ones are far away from the reality as per this Indian astrologer. Now let us look at each of these books. PAULISA Siddhantaka. It was considered as written by one Paul of the Alexandria. Now that has been questioned by David Piggery and other scholars. But all of them, it is very clear that it is a book of Greek origin. Krishna Venkateshwara Sarma or K.V. Sharma, who lived again contemporary of David Piggery and who was a distinguished Indian historian of science, he says PAULISA of Greek origin is the originator of PAULISA Siddhanta, one of the 5 systems of the astronomy of the earlier centuries of the Christian era. And he goes on to say that this has been redacted in the Varahamihira's PANCASIDDHANTIKA, the text that we read right now. Now this is provided by K.V. Sharma, one of the distinguished Indian historian of the science. He says this is of a Greek origin. That much we can be 100% sure. Whether it can be attributed to Paul of Alexandria is questionable. Al-Burni, the Islamic historian who came to India, he was one of them who said this is from Paul of Alexandria. Even Sarvapalli Radhakrishnan and others believed that this is from Paul of Alexandria. The later scholars like David Piggery and all had challenged it, but all of them indisputably agree that this is of Greek origin. So according to the Indian astrologer himself, one of the canonical texts of the Indian astrology is of Greek origin. And K.V. Sharma goes on to say, probably the Hindus prepared an Indianized Sanskrit PAULISA Siddhanta on the basis of Greek work. So Indians understood the Greek work. By that time there are many Greeks who settled in Gujarat, Rajasthan and other places. So through them the Indians understood the Greek astrology and they probably wrote an Indianized Sanskrit of PAULISA Siddhanta. So a Greek work translated and Indianized and taken it as part of the Indian astrology. How about Romaga Siddhanta? The T.S. Kupana Shastri, from whom I take this Panchaga Siddhanta translation of Varahamihira, he says on the commentary of Panchaga Siddhantaka, chapter 1 verse 3, that exact same sloka that we read earlier. Surya himself, being born among the Yavanas by the curse of Brahma, taught the science of Romaga and Duryavana in the city of Romaga, and the Romaga propagated it as the Romaga Siddhantika. So it was of Roman origin, but not wanting to give complete credit to the Romans, they said it is Surya Devan who was born among the Romans, and he taught them, and then they taught to others. So one thing is very clear, this is of Roman origin, one is of Greek origin, another is of Roman origin. And the third I said of the doctrine of Asura, in the Surya Siddhantaka, you can read that text. In chapter 1, it speaks about how this is, the Asura has given it. Again, another fable that is given, that is a Mayasura, a great demon, desiring to obtaining the sound and secret and excellent and sacred and complete knowledge of astronomy, which is the best of the sciences of subordinate to the Veda, practice the most difficult penance, the worship of the sun delighted, the self-delighted sun, being gratified at such difficult penance of Maya, bestowed him on the knowledge of the science of astronomy, which he was enduring after. So again, clearly acknowledging that this book came from an Asura, but trying to attribute it to Surya. So in the case of Romans, in the case of Asura, both clearly acknowledgement that this is a non-Brahminical source, foreign source and a non-Brahminical source, but somehow trying to fit a fable through it so that they can take it. So far we have seen 3 of the canonical texts given by the Indian astrologer Varahamihira are of non-Brahminical origin, and 2 of them are foreign origin, not just non-Brahminical origin, they are of foreign origin as well. So here we are. One of the important limbs of Vedas, the Indian astrology, is heavily borrowed from Greeks, Romans and Asuras without any dispute. Now these are not the evidences. We started with the Brihat Samhita, we have come to the Panchaga Siddhantaka, and now these are not the only evidences. Even we have seen the similarity between the VEDANGAJYOTISA and the Babylonian astronomy in a very brief way. Let us look at one more evidence. Yavana Jataka. Yavana Jataka is the horoscope of Greeks, written by Yavaneshwara, the lord of the Greeks. This is also a Sanskrit book. Sanskrit book written by the lord of the Greeks. Again, highly Indianized, in the sense the original contribution of Hindus such as caste system and all are given in the text. But the text itself acknowledges that this is borrowed from the Greeks. Yavana Jataka, in the text itself, it is mentioned that it is from the Greeks. And the title of the text itself says, so Bilam Mac, again the oldest Indo-Greek text in Sanskrit, revisited, additional readings from the newly discovered manuscript of Yavana Jataka, published in the Journal of the Indian and Buddhist Studies, volume 62, number 3, March 2014. He says, this is could have been considered by a Sanskrit author who was both conversant in Greek and Indian astral science, and he was greatly familiar with the Indian culture and Sanskrit tradition. So he took the Greek ideas and then he Sanskritized it and gave it back. So here we have another text, Yavana Jataka, clearly acknowledging it. So Bilam Mark is arguing that this is an Indianized Greek version incorporating both the Indian and Greek astrology and not a translation. Earlier it was considered as a translation. William Mack is saying no, the Indians have heavily borrowed. They have taken the Greek astrology, but they have Sanskritized it, and it is an original work combining both the learnings of the India and the Greek together, and titled that as Yavana Jataka. Now, even if we accept this argument, this is sufficient for us to prove that you have heavily borrowed from the Greeks. But at this point, I also need to point out, Yavana Jataka itself says something different. In chapter 79, 60, slogan number 60, translation by David Pingree, volume 2, the University of Harvard, published by the University of Harvard. Previously, Yavana Asura, that the lord of the Greeks, whose vision of the truth came by the favor of the sun and whose language is flawless, translated this ocean of words, this jewel mine of horoscopy, which was guided by being written in his tongue. Whose tongue? Yavana Asura's tongue. That is a Greek. So the text itself says that this is a Greek translation, but William Mack would argue that translation in the sense is not literal word-to-word translation. They have taken the idea and translated it. Whatever is the case, the text itself acknowledges, and the scholars acknowledges, and the title acknowledges. One of the Indian astrological books itself is titled as the Horoscope of Greeks. Another is titled as the Doctrine of Romans. So this is where we stand. Indian astrology has heavily borrowed from the Babylon, Greeks, Romans and others. There is nothing to be ashamed of it. You should actually take the whatever you can get it from the others, and you should improve it. And we would see that that is the same thing that had happened in the case of the Indian mathematics, the golden age of the Indian mathematics. Exactly the same thing had happened, how we learned about the astrology. And as I said at the beginning, mathematics itself was a part of the astrology, so this is not a surprising thing after. Now the question is, people like Swami Vivekananda, who are propagators of the Vedic golden age myth, how far they are from the truth? Let us read back Brihat Samhita, Adhyaya 2, Sloka 2, meaning, and Swami Vivekananda's comment. Meaning may be that the learning of the Mleccha disciples of the Aryan teachers is praised here, only to encourage the Mlechas in the pursuit of the Aryan science. So, Brihat Samhita is to encourage the Romans, Greeks and others to learn the Indian astrology, and not that we have learned anything from them. Everything with the exactness can be found in the Vedas. This is the golden age Vedic myth, which can be busted 1,000 times with the needle of the truth. That is what we are doing it here. If your Indian astrology itself is borrowed, then what right do you have to claim, point fingers to others? Now, before I conclude, let me give you some more examples and how the astrology was transformed. Now, let me give you a quote from Mahabharata. Mahabharata, of course, none of us need introduction. In Mahabharata, Book 8, Karna Parva, Section 45, translated by Kisari Mohan Ganguly, it speaks about the different countries. And in that context, when it comes to the Greeks, it says this: Yavanas, O king, are omniscient. Greeks are all-knowing. Why? Why such exaggeration? How can you call anybody as omniscient other than God? We can understand this exaggeration that is given in the Mahabharata only in the context of the astrology. Astrology was considered as one of the best sciences, limbs of the Vedic studies, and if that is very much well established in the Greek than in India, then obviously the Indians had to consider the Greeks as the omniscient. That is the only way we can understand, make sense of this exaggeration. Otherwise, we cannot make sense of this exaggeration at all. So we started with the Brihat Samhita saying that Greeks are considered as Rishis, and we are ending with the Mahabharata statement that the Greeks are omniscient. When Greeks were considered like that, how did the Greeks change? How did the West actually change from this Gargasamhta, Yavana Jataka and PAULISA SIDDHANTA? That is the influence and the brilliance of the Bible. When the Bible, the light of the divine Bible shined upon the West, they had to reject the ignoble parts of the astrology, the abominable parts of the astrology, and only take the mathematics, which is the good part of the astrology. You can see that very clearly. Bishop Isidore of Seville is who lived at the same time of Varahamihira, sometime in AD 560 to AD 636, at the same time when Varahamihira was living here. He was Archbishop there, and he had written several books. Two of his books are on the nature of the things and etymologies. And in the etymologies, the most interesting part is he clearly distinguishes between the good part of the astrology, that is the mathematics, Ganita, as we Indians call, and the remaining horoscope and others. Now this is published in the paper titled Isidore of Seville, Cosmology and Science, published in the Journal of Publications of the Astronomical Observatory of Belgrade, volume 85, page 157 to 162. You can get the full article in the SAO NASA Astrophysics Data System, that is a ADS, a digital library portal for researchers in astronomy and physics. You can get the entire article. In that article, it goes on to show how this bishop has contributed in separating the mathematics, the good part of the astrology, from the bad part. It says, he wrote explicitly about the difference between astronomy and astrology and condemned the latter insofar it aimed in predicting the individual characteristics of men and making conclusions about the state of their bodies and souls. In fact, he may be the first author to make that distinction. So, and he goes on to, the author of this paper goes on to say that the others have claimed about Greeks making, but there is absolutely no proof about it. Bishop of Isidore was the first one to clearly write the distinction between astrology and astronomy. He condemned the astrology and he encouraged the astronomy. The clear difference that we have come to accept in the modern age. How did they do that? By the light of the Holy Bible. Greeks who were considered as Rishis, Greeks who were considered as omniscient, when they really met the Holy Bible, when they started reading the Holy Bible, they threw out all that astrological part, the divination part, the horoscope part, and only redeemed the mathematical part in it. See how Bible can redeem even cultures. That is what we see it in this astrology. Whereas the Hindus, though they have heavily borrowed from the Romans and the Greeks in the wrong matters, they are still refusing to accept the divine light which the West has accepted and being blessed by it. Now it is a turn of India to examine its culture, accept what is good in the light of the Holy Bible and reject what is wrong, and thus redeeming the entire culture and contributing to the whole world. I am concluding this small topic by restating that Indian astrology, which is considered as part of the Vedic studies, has heavily borrowed from Greeks, Romans, Babylonians and others. There is nothing wrong in that, except that it busts the myth that Vedas are the sole source of the Indian culture. Absolutely not. Absolutely not. If your Vedic studies itself has borrowed it from others, how can you say that the Vedas are the only source of the Indian culture? They are just one of the many components in the Indian culture. The Indian culture is awaiting its redemption, and we pray that the God will open the eyes of our brethren in India and we can redeem not only the people but also our culture. May God bless us all. May God continue to bless you all with His word. Amen.